Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Mike Gibb. I run accountsrecovery.net, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar on updating your compliance management system to align with the CFPB's 2021 priorities. Companies should obviously always be tweaking their compliance management systems, and incorporating how the regulators are enforcing consumer protection statutes should be part of that process. Whether something you thought had been allowed is now being targeted by a regulator is an important dynamic to understand, so you can adjust your policies and procedures accordingly. Today in this webinar, which is being sponsored by TCN, we have Joanne Needleman and Leslie Bender from Clark Hill here to walk through how companies in the arm industry should be updating their compliance management systems in the wake of enforcement actions or enforcement actions to come from the CFPB. Before introducing our two speakers, I want to take a quick second and talk about the accountsrecovery.net Slack channel. I just put a link in the chat window for everyone to click on if you haven't signed up and joined. Completely free, doesn't cost you anything. We've got about 525 members as of a few minutes ago who are using the channel to stay in touch with one another, network, interact, and just sort of stay updated on what's going on in the industry. So think of it like a big chat room. So I hope you will consider joining if you haven't done so already. Like I said, it's completely free. Now let me introduce you to our speakers today. Leslie Bender has spent more than 30 years handling compliance, regulatory, transactional, and legal matters for hospitals and financial services companies. Recognized as a national expert on HIPAA and other information privacy and security laws, she was one of the first privacy officers internationally accredited as a certified information privacy professional. She's currently a senior counsel in Clark Hill's Banking and Financial Services Group, specializing in corporate compliance, privacy, transactional, credit, and collections matters. Leslie is a past president of ACA International, serving as president in 2013-2014, and is an officer on its board of directors from 2011 to 2015. Joanne Needleman is the leader of the Consumer Financial Services Regulatory and Compliance Group at Clark Hill. She's a past president of the board of directors of the National Creditors Bar Association and served on the Consumer Financial Protections Bureau's Consumer Advisory Board. Our format for today is going to be a discussion. We encourage everybody to submit questions, and we'll get to them during the course of our conversation. To submit a question, you can do so through either the Q&A tab on your Zoom webinar control panel or sending it to us through the chat module. All right, I think we're ready to get started. I think I've gotten through all of this stuff. Leslie, Joanne, thank you very much. Leslie, this was your idea. This was a great idea. I'm happy to do it. So why don't you sort of kick us off by talking a little bit about why this is such an important topic and why you think it's important now.
Sure. You know, one of the great things about working for Joanne now is that we spend hours debating all the things that are developing in Washington and at the states. And so it seemed like it would only be fair for us to share some of the things that we think about all the time. And so what we thought would be interesting for people today, Mike, would be to talk about reading the tea leaves. As everybody knows, the purported leader for the CFPB, leader number 5, is currently a commissioner who has been extremely active in the Federal Trade Commission, who feels that the federal regulators have not done enough to punish corporate wrongdoers for the things that they do, and had sort of been leading the charge. And as recently as last week has continued to, voice a very consistent message from the FTC. At the same time, the acting director, David Wiggio, who I like to call the most active acting director ever of any agency, has been very busy. And so, Joanne, let's start with the most recent first. Today, you noted that...
I'll start. What happened today? The dogs got all excited. So.
They did get very excited. Go, you better run with it.
Very excited.
Yes, run with it.
So when we were putting this together, one of the issues that we wanted to talk about on our list, and it was kind of in the middle, was this advisory that came out from acting director Wiggio, and if I mispronounce his name, my apologies in advance, and was about this whole landlord-tenant eviction issue. As you know, the CDC released guidance and has suggested, it's not a law, but has suggested a moratorium, a national moratorium on evictions, because obviously when the pandemic happened, a lot of people, especially renters, lost their job. There was a period of time where they didn't have employment, and how are they going to pay the rent? So there was kind of this stay of rental payments. That has successively been extended, and now it's extended to, I think, September of this year. But, you know, they have come out consistently. The CDC has come out with a lot of guidance regarding health issues and other issues regarding the pandemic. All right, so fast forward to our new acting director. And what he actually did is put out it's really almost like an NPR to amend Reg F with regard to legal evictions and notices and requirements that you have to give to tenants, which include the CDC guidance. When I read that, I was like, well, I mean, look, intent and purpose of all of this we get, okay? There's a lot of harm that has happened during this pandemic, but let's put our emotion aside and let's look at the law. How can the CFPB utilize CSC guidance into a regulation regarding the FDCPA? I mean, I kind of felt it was a bit of an overreach. Now, Mike reported today that there was maybe a landlord association that sued the CFPB on that. However, what I didn't realize, or it hadn't been reported, was that there had been maybe an injunction or a request to the DC District Court to say, you know, can this moratorium, can this federal moratorium stand? And today, the Wall Street Journal just reported about an hour and a half ago that a federal judge on the DC District Court said, no, it can't. CFPB, you have overreached. And I think it's really, really important and talks about the dynamic that we're going into this year and next year, which you have to keep in mind when you're kind of reassessing your compliance management system and how either you or your vendors are engaging yourself in financial services. And that's this. So we remember 10 years ago when the CFPB first started, they made a lot of directives. They had a lot of priorities. They had a lot of guidance. And as we know from former Director Cordray, they wanted to push the envelope. And they did. But in that time, the judiciary, especially in the last 4 years, has changed. I mean, the landscape of the judiciary has changed. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic to see that the CFPB is definitely taking that same push the envelope, ultra aggressive protection of consumers and how it aligns with this new judiciary. And I think what happened this afternoon is a perfect example, and we're going to see a lot of that.
So if you're a company that is in the business of collecting commercial or consumer rents, do you respect the moratorium? I mean, obviously everybody's going to try to work with people, but if you're tuning up your compliance management program, what kind of guidance should we give people, Joanne, if this is their bread and butter work?
Well, another topic that we want to spend a lot of time on, and I guess I can weave it in here, is the issue of UDAAP. So at the and this administration, it is very, very clear. It is about equality, it's about equity, it's about fairness, it's about eliminating discrimination. And that has to be, in addition to seeing, that's a huge CFPB priority. I mean, you just saw, again, we have an active acting director who issued a guidance, I think, was it 2 days ago, about problems, and we're gonna get into this a little deeper, but problems that consumers are having with their mortgages. Do they know they're in forbearance? Do they know that they can get a loss mitigation? And it is impacting, according to this study by the CFPB, Hispanic and minorities at a lot greater rate. I haven't looked at the data, but this is what this report is proposing and what it is saying. So to answer your question, Leslie, is there an FDCPA claim to a landlord who uses a law firm or others to use legal process to evict somebody? I think this court is saying we need to think about that and maybe otherwise. Is it a UDAAP? Maybe. So that's, I mean, I think UDAAP, at the end of the day, if they cannot push through typical federal consumer financial law, the priorities that they want to push, UDAAP is the big fallback. And I think it is clear by the acting director rescinding the UDAAP guidance that we had last year from Director Kraninger and going back to the future on that and developing UDAAP through enforcement, which is what the FTC has done for 30 years under Section 5. Then I think we have to, it's consumers first. We're back to consumers first, not that we never said it wasn't consumers first, but I think that the UDAAP has got to be in the back of everybody's mind, and you have to think about that before engaging in any consumer-facing activity.
And that's a good point, because in the Back to the Future theme, remember how under Director Cordray, oftentimes the same conduct might constitute different prongs of the unfair and deceptive act or abusive practice.
Right. That's
so
right.
You could do one thing wrong, and you remember those early enforcement actions about the ID theft protection that never really worked for a lot of people because there was a data problem.
Right.
Those were considered unfair, deceptive, and abusive acts or practices. So they were 3 dings, not even a double ding. They were a triple ding.
That's right.
And so clearly the retraction that you've described could open the door. And we also remember under the Cordray era, and now I guess our friend is going to be in the student loan space, but in the Cordray era, we also had to pay attention to first party, not just third party work, because
right.
a UDAAP under Dodd-Frank applies to all financial services and all the work of service providers.
Any covered person. That's right.
So we need sort of a 360, and we need to tune up our compliance management system to make sure that when we're doing a new process, onboarding a new line of business, that we look at how our work is going to flow from the perspective of a consumer and make sure it doesn't ring any of those bells repeatedly.
Leslie, you and I have had a lot of these conversations, and we've witnessed this in a lot of work that we have done in the last 6 months. And we can't stress enough in some of the supervisions that we have been involved in, it really does at the end of the day come down to the compliance management system. Not even if you had an error or even if you had large scale errors, they're coming in with that mindset first. And that is in the past year. So that's under the Kraninger, regime. So now we're going into even a more aggressive regime. But I think supervision policy has developed over the last, 6 or 7 years into this mindset that CMS first. And you could have a bad CMS, but have a very low error rate or even have low complaints. But if the CMS is not up to snuff, that's a problem. And they don't care whether you've had 11 mistakes on credit reporting or you have 20 complaints in last year from consumers that say it's not me. That's irrelevant. The task force that was put together was very critical of that because it shouldn't be about how you study for the test. It should be the results of the test. But but the theme in the last year, even under a more, I don't want to say liberal, but the Kraninger regime was very different than what we've seen before. Supervision policy has not changed. And I think it's going to be even more important that your compliance management systems not only be airtight, but are pliable and can adapt and change in any situation.
I think you're making a good point, because I think also when we look at some of the state exams and supervisions,
right. Nevada,
the margins of error are less than 1%.
That's right.
And so you find that, first of all, your compliance management system documentation needs to be crystal clear. It needs to be understandable by your workforce. It needs to have policy that's set by your highest governing body, because we've seen situations where the highest governing body needs to be an active participant. So that has to happen at the policy level. But then as you break down how that policy is going to be carried out, your workforce needs to really know about it. You can't just have cool stuff on the shelf, because that's a classic FTC Act violation. And you know, I think that would be another thing to test is, I mean, sure, you got to make sure you're doing what you said you were doing, but it seems like you also have to be aware of how state regulators are buddying up on this. And you need to make sure that your workforce, many of whom may still be remote, need
Right.
to be very engaged in how to find the stuff in your compliance management system. Wouldn't you think?
Absolutely. And you touched on, I think, one of the biggest tweaks to a lot of compliance management systems that we have seen is the work from home policy and the remote policy. I mean, you have to kind of adapt to what's going on outside of the four walls of your business, which right now are not four walls. They're, everybody's scattered in a different place, and it may stay that way. Your workforce operations are very different now. But again, we can't reiterate the point enough. It is your CMS is an organic document. It has basic principles, but it has to be flexible and it has to change. And that is why we wanted to bring this webinar to you, because there's been so many changes at the Bureau, and you're going to have to make those tweaks.
And I love your expression, back to the future, which maybe some of the friends that are on this webinar aren't old enough to even know what that was, but maybe Mike can put a link. So
right. Mike was in kindergarten when that happened.
I'm really old. I don't want to do that.
But I mean, let's look at the lineup now of regulators. So we have an acting director who has been at the Bureau since 2012.
Yep.
We have a director who is, whether you like his perspective or not, a brilliant, articulate, very passionate person about everything he does, who also was the czar for student lending at the CFPB under Richard Cordray. And now the czar for student lending is at the Department of Ed, where they also have a moratorium, I think through 9/30, that somehow
September as well. Yep.
He's got to get that ball rolling. And so we have three really impactful people who all sing from the same song sheet in kind of critical jobs. And then the FTC. So there is no time like the present to make sure you do what you say and say what you do. But, this is a very methodical strategy for Back to the Future that we have only begun to experience, and maybe the only check and balance are the courts, unless of course you're in the 11th Circuit, but we're not going to go into that rabbit warren.
There's others more well-versed have spoken better about that, Hunstein. So,
but vendor management still needs to be one of our priorities.
Well, again, okay, we won't stay on Hunstein too long, but Hunstein came out, you better pick up your compliance management system and look at your vendor management responsibilities, because for the moment, they've changed. At least if you're doing business in Florida, Georgia, and I believe Alabama, 3 states.
So Mike, I can tell you're trying to get a word in edgewise. Give it a try again.
It was interesting because I'm not sure a lot of people saw it, but the FTC last week fined Vivid $20 million for violating FCRA, and Commissioner Chopra included a statement in there this $20 million fine. He called it a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
So.
Yes. Yes. So, and he applauded the fact that finally a corporate wrongdoer has had to experience some economic consequence and couldn't just greedily, make money on the backs of unsuspecting consumers and have nothing to come from it. Now, of course,
I think that's fine, and I understand that. And this was a bad actor, and I think that all of us in the industry want to make sure that bad actors are out of the industry. And this was a significant issue. But I also think a lot of his and others on the FTC were kind of channeling the recent decision from the Supreme Court, which really curtailed the FTC's ability to impose fine and disgorgement. That was that they really pulled the rug out from under them in the recent Supreme Court case. So I think a lot of that was being channeled. But I think to your point, Leslie and Mike, we are going back. I mean, the there was a lot of discussion that there was, enforcement was down. Well, I will tell you in 2020, enforcement was as high as it was in the heyday of Richard Cordray. I think what was different were the penalties and the remedies and things like that. And I think we're going to go back to that, which is concerning, which is very, very concerning.
One of the things that sort of seems like it's coming, Joanne, and I know thanks to Jack Gordon for some data that he provides through Mike about court cases, it looks like March was a banner month for Fair Credit Reporting Act litigation,
And FTCPA.
perhaps one of the highest months ever of new filings. We haven't seen a lot about credit reporting other than that the CFPB snatched back the flexibility memo due to the pandemic and the extra 15 days that data furnishers had. So, Joanne, when you look in your crystal ball and you think about fine-tuning the compliance management system, what do you see coming down the pike from an FCRA perspective?
Well, Mike has talked a lot about that on his webinars. Mike, I know you have asked the credit reporting experts. I think we all agree in the industry that credit reporting is going to be priority number one once I think Director Chopra gets into the CFPB, which is only a matter of time. And that stems from a couple things. It's the highest, yay, debt collection is not highest anymore. It's now credit reporting. I mean, since the pandemic, it is just credit reporting complaints. Now, what's interesting is I just interviewed Francis Creighton from CDIA on my podcast, which will, sorry, Mike, sorry for the shameless plug, but that will run, in the next day or two. And he also was interviewed by American Banker. The credit reporting industry is very concerned. They're obviously concerned about the complaints, but they're concerned about the source of complaints. There has been such an uptick since the pandemic started. Obviously, we knew this. There was going to be scam and fraudsters. We know that the credit repair industry is very robust. And their concern is this desire to prey on vulnerable consumers right now, to tell them that they are going to eliminate negative but accurate credit reporting information is a problem. And many on this call, as I'm looking at the participants, do credit reporting. And, by God, every day you're getting trays and trays and trays and trays of the same complaint with a different consumer's name from the same address. And that is a problem. And so I think that credit reporting is going to be a concern. From a compliance management standpoint, you better make sure that your dispute processes, your data integrity, your accuracy, the audits that you do are in line, they're consistent, they're reviewed, the results are addressed. How you address those results are going both down to the people who are doing them as well as up to your highest governing body. Credit reporting is important. And unfortunately, as we know, you get these frivolous and duplicative disputes, you got to respond to them. So, technology. The more we can figure out how to do this so it doesn't drain your operational resources, that's what you need to think about.
So maybe our tip there with respect to the CMS is that maybe historically you've resisted really beefing up your frivolous and irrelevant dispute policy or your CRO policy. There is no time like the present to sort of figure out what your policy should be and maybe look at some of your frontline support people who are reviewing your correspondence or fishing documents out of your eOSCR so that they have some checklists or some other standards they can use, because maybe by improving that front end process, you can reduce some of your workload later on.
Absolutely.
We've also heard,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, the other thing I would say too is, these disputes, these churning of these frivolous disputes, it is so important for industry to be collecting that data and getting it to the Bureau. One thing Francis said is that, we really have to, this is a consumer harm. consumers are absolutely being harmed by this. Half of them don't even know that these disputes are ending up in your agencies or ending up in your company. So in the process, please put your data together, send them to your trade ACA, your trade associations, whether you're with CRC, send them directly to John McNamara as far as I'm concerned. Sorry, John, if you're on the webinar. But the CFPB needs to know of the volume of this, and this really needs to be addressed.
Yep. So we have, thank goodness, one of our friends has written in about medical debt, and this has been a banner year. And so let me go just a step or two down the history lane here. The National Consumer Law Center in 2019 really latched on to how normal collection activities and normal credit reporting activities seem really unfair when it comes to medical debt, because medical debt is kind of involuntary debt, right? Nobody plans to need an appendectomy. Nobody wanted to be hospitalized for COVID, and so on and so forth. So the NCLC put together a uniform law called the Medical Debt Protection Act, and they started lobbying very hard to many states as well as to Maxine Waters. So as you saw, Maxine Waters has implemented some of the provisions of the NCLC's uniform law in her 8-headed package that I believe is going to go to the House floor, maybe even next week or soon, that's come out of committee. So it would be very important, if you haven't taken a look at the NCLC's medical debt protection white papers and recommendations to Biden about what his office should be doing. But it is important to note that that law and significant parts of it is about to be signed into law in the state of Maryland. It's on the governor's desk now, and it has a very quick time frame. So for anyone in the audience, that part of your strategy is legal collections, part of your strategy is credit reporting, and you are servicing medical clients, you're going to need to start doing some compilations of data about the racial and ethnic backgrounds and percentages of people that are subjected to those fairly extraordinary collection activities. So pay attention. There's a lot of things going on. There are 6 or 7 other states. And as you know, many of the states' general assemblies don't meet all year. So they are now winding down. And we heard this morning that this law has sprung up in Nevada, and it came from behind, just as it did in Maryland. Nobody even had eyes on this. We were part of conversations, and this wasn't even a thing back in January, and it just caught on in March, and it is rocketing through. So it's very important to have something in your CMS, I think, Joanne, that has a way for you to keep your finger on the pulse of things that affect your creditors or things that will affect you in servicing your creditors. And medical debt and what is done with it is a super blistering hot topic right now.
I think what's interesting about the Maryland law, which is consistent with what is going on at the federal level, and I think in other states, is this, again, fairness, equity, prevention of discrimination. It is, very, why do you think all these limited English proficiency requirements are coming in? It's about making sure that that the communications, are given to as many people as possible. They understand them, because that would only be the fair way to do it. I'm going to segue real quickly, Leslie, in when we talk about different types of verticals. So you talked about medical debt. So, again, I look at the Maryland law and everything else. How are you treating all your, are your customers of, Hispanic or ethnic or, Black, LGBTQ? I mean, you name it. As you're servicing this medical debt, are those groups being treated differently by your servicing? That is a huge issue. Leslie and I were looking at, again, a recent bulletin from the CFPB, and actually the CFPB came out with a report a couple days ago about mortgage servicing and how it's impacting different minority groups. I mean, do you see a theme here? About a week or so ago, the Bureau issued guidance regarding mortgage servicing, because there is this fear that there's going to be another, financial crisis in terms of housing and foreclosures. And so they issued some guidance, and these are the things they're going to look at. I mean, mortgage services, I'm really sorry you've had a really bad year. It's not going to get any better because you're going to get supervised this year. And they basically gave you a laundry list of items that they're going to be looking at. And one of them is comply with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Now, this is a mortgage servicer, by the way. The loan's been done, but comply with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act's prohibition against discrimination against any applicant with respect to any aspect of the credit transaction. Now, here they're talking about loss mitigation and loan modifications, and I get that. But the idea of applying equal credit opportunity principles to all aspects of financial services is an area where the CFPB is going to go. And in fact, when you talk about credit reporting, again, another bulletin that came out about credit reporting was that, I think it was a report about consumer complaints and disputes. Are you responding to disputes or are you impacting minority groups differently when you respond to the dispute, or are they filing more complaints than others? I mean, this is how the Bureau is going to look at all of this. So you better make sure that your CMS, why would a debt collection agency think about ECOA? I mean, I wouldn't, right. But you better have ECOA principles in your policies, in your response to disputes, how you're dealing with consumers, because the Bureau is going to look at that. And maybe they won't find it. I don't know how they can find it a COA violation, but again, we're going back to UDAAP. I think that.
Well, and we have a couple questions.
Yep.
Coral and David have both asked, how are collection agencies even supposed to know? I mean, short of making some assumptions based on somebody's surname or the type of procedure they had done, if it was a medical or, whatever the nature of the collection is, or if you somehow crisscross with, zip code data to say, okay, X% of the people that live in this neighborhood are whatever. I don't know how you would know gender, let alone ethnic or racial or, any other protected class.
Well, I think it begs the question is that there is a responsibility now. I think the Bureau is kind of thinking about let's just look at debt collection for a second. You get some information from your client, name, address, balance. Maybe you get an application or whatever. Maybe you look at it, maybe you don't. I think all that information now has to be looked at. I think you're going to have to know what the original, not the paper application, but it is so important now to have these conversations with your clients, because you're going to need to get this data. You're going to need to look at it. In healthcare, they may have it in the admission forms. In the credit card, they could have it. And you know what? If they don't have it, then you need to make arrangements to say, we looked at the data and we could not find any ethnicity. So to show that at least you made an attempt to figure out who this consumer is. I think somewhere along the line that needs to be documented, because I agree with you, Leslie. How is the Bureau going to do it? I don't know, but look at some of the ECOA lending enforcement actions that occurred in the mid 2010s, especially in the auto space. You'll recall, was it Toyota, Honda, whatever that big one was that CFPB had with DOJ? You know how they determined it? By last name. And it turned out that half the last names were not minorities.
Right.
Did that stop Toyota from writing a check for millions and millions of dollars? So it's really it needs to be part of the discussion. I think.
And there may be data elements to your point that your creditor is obtaining. You know, like even now when you apply for a job or whatever, there's always that optional affirmative action page. So you may need to get a feed of that data now. And, that's always kind of were you better off not knowing? Were you better off knowing? If you're going to have to start reporting on that, then you're going to have to now add to your new client onboarding. Are you capturing this data and can you feed it to us in some sort of a field? And yes, Amy's just written in, of course you can get sort of stung on a disparate impact, even if you didn't have a disparate intent. That's right. Why when you look at Maryland's Medical Debt Protection Act, not to beat up poor Maryland, tiny state that it is, you know, hospitals are going to have to do a report starting almost immediately when this bill becomes a law on how many people in which, you know, socioeconomic and ethnic and racial class they're taking extraordinary actions versus their, you know, other patients who aren't in protected classes. And I think that we know already from some of the guidance statements that the CFPB has issued since January that this is a hot button. And I thought it was very interesting when you listen to the output from the task force that Kathy Kraninger had put together. Reg B in and of itself is kind of outdated and how it applies. Absolutely. And I mean, for all the friends on this call who service healthcare, how many times have you had hospitals or other medical providers that automatically put a spouse in the guarantor field, you know, even when the Maryland bill is HB 565, House Bill 565. It has a companion bill, but I think it's gone to the governor's desk as HB 565. It's 18 pages long, so if you can't sleep tonight, it's a good one to read. But I think that it would be, you know, pretty important to start brainstorming these things. And back to our earlier comment about really engaging your highest governing body, there are some talking points here that your compliance leaders are going to need to bring to your highest governing body about, okay, we know that equal credit opportunity, whatever form that takes, it's always been a module for collection agency exams. I can now put 2 and 2 together and see, okay, we're going to go to a legal collector and we are going to go to a data furnishing collector, and we're going to see what percentage of the people they sue or credit report fall into protected classes, and start to make some, you know, 2 + 2 is 7 kind of conclusions from that. And I think that we need to start having conversations with our highest governing body and talk about some of these issues, because we have half a dozen great questions or comments that go right to this. How are we going to know? Well, I think to Joanne's point, somehow you're going to have to find a way to draw some reasonable inferences about this. And it might be thinking outside the box that you've normally approached this, because you need to make sure there's not a disparate impact. Thank you, Coral, for that comment in the box.
I'm sorry, I just need to, I hate to jump in and I apologize for interrupting, but I've been trying I need to say something and just wanted to sort of promote and TCN, the sponsor of today's webinar. I've been meaning to get that out for a while now. So allow me a second. TCN provides cost-effective call center solutions for contact centers, collection agencies, and thousands of businesses worldwide. TCN has continually stayed current with TCPA and CFPB changes by introducing enhancements to its core platform, one of which is TCN's natural language compliance, which uses smart algorithms to build compliance rules naturally. Simply type your rule into the TCN Compliance Manager, and the natural language compliance engine will build an easy to understand compliance rule. One example of a rule would be deny outbound calls before 8 a.m. or after 9 p.m. You can even type in a rule that would limit 7 calls in 7 days. There's no limit to the number of rules TCN's compliance processing engine can compute. TCN software is a platform suite that also provides provides built-in data management services that eliminate data entry errors, business intelligence with reporting dashboards, call recording with storage, smart IVR with payment capabilities, speech analysis and transcription, and much more. Regardless of size, location, or application, TCN can provide robust solutions for your call center and collection agency. Give TCN a call today, or please visit them at www.tcn.com for more information. Thanks again to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar. And Joanne, Leslie, I apologize for butting in, but I will step back and let the two of you continue with this really, really interesting discussion.
No, I think that is great. And one of the interesting things, not to pivot and talk about another rabbit warren, but since the Facebook decision by the Supreme Court, a lot of TCPA cases have kind of, frizzled because of the Supreme Court's determination that we need to go back to the text of the TCPA and what really is an ATDS. Well, guess who some of the friends are who are filing some of the Hunstein cases? They're your old class action friends who used to file TCPA cases. So if we were wondering where those people went, so, take a close look, they are trying something new.
Yep. So I want to shift gears to talk about student loans, in case there's anybody on the webinar about student loans, because an interesting development happened with student loans yesterday or the day before, I can't remember. So as Leslie mentioned, our dear friend Richard Cordray has a new job, and he's going to be the CEO of federal student loans at Department of Education. And I think if you want to talk about tea leaves, I think there's a lot to be read from that. And if I'm in the student loan space, whether I'm private or servicing a Department of Ed, I think you need to pay attention. And I probably am not telling you something that you haven't already thought about in the last 48 hours. But I think what's interesting is a couple things. First, as we mentioned, federal student loan payments have been suspended, and they are set to lapse. That suspension was extended, and I think it's now till September, which means that you can't collect it's an automatic suspension. However, if a consumer calls in and says, I do want to pay, you can do that. I don't know how often that has happened. So it's been very tough for student loan servicers in that space. I suspect that when Mr. Cordray goes into DOE, he's going to look at this again and determine whether there should be a further extension. And my guess is there may be. So that's issue number one. Issue number two is when Richard Cordray was director of the CFPB, there wasn't a lot of alignment with the CFPB and DOE. I can't say that there was bad blood, but they couldn't quite figure out how to work together. Well, as many of you know, Mr. Chopra was not only a student loan ombudsman, but he had a very close working relationship with Rich Cordray. So I think that now DOE and the CFPB are going to be very much aligned. When Rohit Chopra was first discussed as being the new director, I think that everybody thought that one of his top priorities, because of all the work that he did when he was at the CFPB, is going to be on student loans. Now that's going to be on the private end. So I think now you're getting it from, you have the CFPB is going to focus on private student loans and private student loan servicing. And now you have Richard Cordray at DOE is going to look at federal student loans. So you've got two formative people in two important agencies who are going to be looking at this. I think it's going to be challenging, to say the least. And it's going to be interesting to see how Reg F is going to align with, certainly on the private end, and what sort of enforcement. I think there's going to be a lot of data collection that is going to go on in trying to, I think in their mind, improve the system. But again, Richard Cordray was very focused on enforcement. You know, we all knew the term regulation by enforcement. So I think he's going to develop and really provide the CFPB with a lot of information that is going to help them on the enforcement end when it comes to student loans. Of course, I think, as we know, there's been somewhat of a conversation between the administration, the progressive, the Elizabeth Warrens of the world about student loan forgiveness. And I think that we know that Richard Cordray is very much aligned with Elizabeth Warren. She picked him to run the agency when it was clear she was not going to. And I think that the idea of forgiveness, while President Biden said is, I'm not forgiving any loans, I do think what Richard Cordray will do is enhance the loan forgiveness program, which does need to be fixed. And if he could figure out a robust program to do that, it could be very beneficial. That doesn't say much for the servicers on the call, but I think that that has been a source of a lot of problems. And I think that's an area that he's going to address. But again, if you're in the student loan servicing space or student loan collection space, boy, oh boy, is now a time to start looking at your CMS, because you've got some formidable people who are going to be looking very critically at the activities that you do.
And I think, Joanne, to your point, the pandemic and the desire to really have a sustainable recovery from the pandemic is going to put more pressure on mortgage
Yes.
servicers, as you talked about earlier,
Yes.
and then also on taking a look at student loan. Like the articles already are talking about how important it's going to be to make sure disclosures are clear and that people aren't being allowed to overborrow. And it's kind of sounding like the old Barney Frank days where, you know, the underwriting criteria were opened up for mortgages to try to make more mortgages available. And then people had these adjustable rate mortgages that they could never afford once they adjusted. And then we had all these foreclosures. And so I think that there's a lot of the back to the future, as you described it, going on in a lot of different scenarios, but people's housing and people's student loans, that two things that could really hold them back from being able to recover in this pandemic, I think are going to garner a lot of attention. And then, of course, if God forbid you needed medical attention, that would be sort of like the, trifecta.
Right. So I think we need to pay very, very close attention to what Richard Cordray is going to do. He's going to have tremendous authority in that space to do a lot of things, not necessarily enforcement related. And hopefully, I think that he could support a lot of enforcement, which is what I think he's going to do in working with Director Chopra. But I certainly hope, I think one of the issues that has plagued DOE and the whole student loan servicing space is the infrastructure itself. And hopefully, if he can get in there, I mean, it's much easier to get student loans than it is to repay it back. And Leslie, you and I can relate. Mike's a little too young. I mean, when we applied for college, we typed up our applications. We had to send separate applications. Now there's Common App, which is the easiest thing in the world for a student to apply and you can do all your student loan applications through Common App. So there needs to be, there's just not a centralized way of having to service student loans, which I think has been, really wrought with problems and difficulties for those who are servicing it. And the rules and the regulations are so layered and convoluted that there really needs to be an overhaul. Is Richard Cordray, the one who's going to do it? I don't know, but I think there's opportunity there, and hopefully he will consider some of that.
But no time like the present to sharpen your pencil about your compliance management system so that you know what it is that people are doing when they're servicing any of these categories of accounts, and strengthen your ECOA policy. Make sure your training is up to date, maybe that your training is refreshed, especially as some of your workforce may be permanently remote. And I think all of those are things that would be opportunities. And make sure that the policies and procedures that you have in your CMS are still current now that you have new processes for doing stuff. If some of your workforce is permanently remote. You know, we've seen some situations where maybe a little bit more auditing, you know, trust but verify is necessary, especially when people are working remotely, or half your workforce comes in on even days and half your workforce comes in on odd days. You know, there are a lot of funny changes that, you know, last year we had the panic of the shelter in place orders, and God willing, we won't have those again this year. But, you know, these are all things that certainly merit some attention. We have a question in the chat box about what are some software programs for compliance management systems that would be advisable. And I guess, you know, maybe that's something that Mike will have friends cover in a future session, but here are some things that I think, let me start the ball rolling, Joanne, and then you please chime in. Whatever system you're picking, make sure you have the horsepower, not only to launch it, but to sustain it.
Yeah.
There would be nothing worse than investing in a compliance management system that either is the wrong size. Remember Cinderella when the prince went around with the wrong shoe, and, you know, all the, you know, stepsisters tried to fit into the shoe even though their feet were too big. You do not want to have a you know, automated CMS that's the wrong size for your organization. If you're good at making decisions, and we've seen some beautiful examples in the last 6 months of really pretty small companies that have amazing CMSs, just naturally. So make sure you get the right size, and that it doesn't make decisions on its own for you that are different from how you're used to making decisions, unless you're ready to embrace that. And don't buy something that you can't sustain just to have something. You'd be better off having a bunch of horrors, Excel spreadsheets, you know, or a Windows 3, you know, Microsoft 365 SharePoint or something. But those would be two pitfalls that I would avoid if I'm doing an RFP or an RFI with some vendors who have those types of things that maybe Mike will invite someday in the future to come.
So Patty Bass asked a great question, and it's something I want to elaborate on. What Leslie said is, you know, can you elaborate on what you mean about size? So, you know, when you think about a CMS, the CMS has 4 components. It has board reporting, it has policies and procedures, it has internal auditing, and it has training and monitoring. And there's a couple more in there, but those are to me, the 4 core principles. So when you're thinking about software, of those 4 core principles, what do you need help with? Maybe you have a great process right now that reports to the board. Maybe your communication with the board is great. You know, it goes up, it goes down, the reports are easy. Then you don't need a CMS that deals with that. Maybe you have a process right now that houses all your policies and procedures. You're able to access them. You're able to update them. Everybody knows when you update them. Everybody's required to read them. Then you don't need a software system for that. So I think the first thing before you look at systems is really to see what your needs are. And what can the technology do that doesn't waste your staff's time putting together? Because remember, unfortunately, we all have to have a CMS, but it is not revenue generating. It takes people, time, and we all have to do it, but we have day jobs. We got to get to our day jobs. So what can we systemically fit into the process that will help people continue to do our day jobs and do them correctly, by the way, because that's what the CMS is there for. So I hope that answers your question. I mean, they come in all shapes and flavors and sizes. But I think that as a company, you need to do your own analysis first to determine your need.
I think one other thing, you know, having run a number of RFPs for folks to look at different vendors, I think another thing that is pretty important is just jump in. When you buy the damn thing, jump in. Maybe have a test group, have them start to use it. Maybe some of the vendors will want business, and maybe, who knows, maybe they will let you try different things for a while, but jump in and try it. You can always ask them to erase your first 30 days of data. That was your trial period where you just, gave t-shirts to people that wrote stuff up or looked stuff up or did a scavenger hunt or something, but
Right.
jump in and use it. Don't overly complicate it. If you're
Right.
going to invest in a compliance management system, use the damn thing. Maybe you'll find out that there's some type of report that it has that you don't need. So you'll decide in your first 30 days of ollie income free. But I love your point, Joanne, about the tickler system. It's great to have a system that tickles people, that says, hey, Leslie, there's a new procedure. You were supposed to sign off on it. Everybody else is waiting. Sign off on it. So, that might be something worth thinking about. If you have IT resource and you have a genius on your staff who's good at SharePoint, maybe you're better off building your own SharePoint, that can get emails and populate them and stuff like that. But I really think that it's once you've made the decision, and there are so many wonderful vendors out there that would be happy to come and do presentations. Once they do them and once you try stuff, let all the people who are stakeholders in your organization have a go at it.
I think it's important to I lost my train of thought for a second, sorry. Think about this. Yeah, okay. The compliance management system you're reporting is not so much for, it is to ensure that internally everybody is on the same page with regard to compliance. But remember, especially if you're a big company, even if you're not a big company, how about your clients? It also has to be there for somebody else to see and review. So if a third party were to come in, whether it be a client or whether it be an outside auditor, they have to be able to understand it. It can't be this hieroglyphics that only the people in your company can understand, because then when you really need it and to show your compliance, you're going to have to spend so much time explaining what what your reports say, what the outcomes say. So, think of it as, you want to explain it to a kindergartner. It has to be that simple. And I think the simpler, the better.
Well, Mike, thank you for indulging us today. This was great. And thank you to the audience. There are a lot of our good friends in the audience. Thank you for being with us today. We loved having the chance to visit with you. And Mike, as always, thank you for the podium.
Well, I'm the one that should be thanking both of you. So Joanne and Leslie, thank you so much for coming here and sharing your wisdom and your insight with the audience today on behalf of everybody who isn't able to articulate how much they appreciated it. Thank you. This was a great conversation. And it really just kind of makes you think and sort of look at things a little bit differently, which I think is really important and a really interesting perspective. So I appreciate your time and your effort, and thank you very much for that today. Thank you to everybody who watched and listened. Appreciate that. Thanks again to TCN for sponsoring today's webinar. Check them out at tcn.com if you haven't. We're back tomorrow. Tomorrow is Thursday. We're talking about Regulation F and medical debt, how to collect under Regulation F. So if you haven't signed up for that, there's a link in the events calendar on accountsrecovery.net. And on Friday, we're finishing off the week with another Hunstein decision, but looking at it from the perspective of collection agencies and how they're responding and should be responding to that ruling. So if you haven't signed up for that, as well, there's a link in the accountsrecovery.net events calendar. So thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thanks, Mike.
Have a great rest of the day. We'll talk to everybody soon. Take care.
Yeah.